Hi everyone, my name is Bean and you're watching a special edition of Battle of the Band. Today we are revealing the new tournament. The Beatles are over. The Beatles are almost over anyway. They only have a week left, so it's time to reveal what we're doing next. So what we're going to be doing next is called the Thrash Bash. And what that entails is taking the big four of thrash metal, that is Metallica, Megadeth, Slayer, and Anthrax, and throwing their first four albums into a single elimination style tournament and deciding which song is the best out of those four albums. Now, I randomized the tournament so it's possible that Megadeth could face off against Megadeth, Slayer could face off against Slayer, and so on. It's just completely random, so you can eliminate yourself in this tournament. It's like, say, if you had I like to think of it as wrestling stables. Let's say you've got NWO and Degeneration X in a dream match or in a dream tournament against each other for the stable championship, but they have to it's just randomized like from their members, and they have to go against each other sometimes. You know, it happens in tournaments all the time. So I'm pretty excited about this tournament. It's going to be 128 songs. The first four albums of each of these bands actually equals out to being more than that. Like it's like 138, I think, or something like that. But I cut out every instrumental, I cut out every song that was under 2 minutes, and I cut out every cover. Ideally, I would like to include everything, but I didn't want to have to do a whole bunch of buys. This tournament's already going to be complicated enough as it is. So we cut those out. As a nod to them, maybe we'll play those songs for our intros on other videos. A lot of those instrumentals are really long, though, so we can't possibly play the whole thing, right? So let's talk about these bands a little bit. Since we're doing just the first four albums, we won't even consider the latter part of these bands' histories. So things like 90s Metallica won't come into question. It doesn't matter. So the first three albums from Metallica actually have a different lineup than the last one we'll be listening to from Metallica. Metallica formed in Los Angeles in 1981, and it was formed by James Hetfield and Lars Ulrich, the lead guitarist and vocalist and drummer, respectively. But it's been based out of San Francisco for most of its career. The other two members in the first three albums were Kirk Hammett, the lead guitarist, I guess you'd call him. Yeah, Kirk Hammett's the lead guitarist, James Hetfield's the rhythm guitarist, and Cliff Burton was on the first three albums. And in the fourth album, after Cliff Burton had died, Jason Newsted took over as the bassist for a time. So the Metallica albums we'll be pulling from are Kill 'Em All, released in 1983, the same year I was born. Ride the Lightning, released in 1984. Master of Puppets, released in 1986. And those three albums feature Cliff Burton on bass. And the final album we'll be covering from Metallica is And Justice for All, released in 1988, the first album to feature Jason Newsted on bass. One day we'll do a Metallica tournament and we'll revisit these songs, but we'll pit them up against all their newer songs. That's going to be a lot of fun, but we're not doing that right now. Right now, they have to go up against their big four peers. So the next of the big four of thrash metal is Megadeth. Megadeth is a thrash metal band formed by Dave Mustaine in 1983 in Los Angeles. So the only constant member of Megadeth's membership throughout the span of Megadeth's career has been Dave Mustaine. And actually, and David Ellefson was part of it for a long time, but he did have a long gap in there where he wasn't, and he's no longer a part of Megadeth. And there were a few band members in and out before Megadeth finally released an album. Their first album was released in 1985, and that is Killing Is My Business and Business Is Good. And Megadeth's second album was Peace Sells, But Who's Buying, released in 1986. At that point, they had Dave Mustaine, of course, as the front man, also credited for piano, and of course, he was the lead guitarist and vocals. David Ellefson, the bassist and backing vocals. They had, and at that time, Gar Samuelson was on drums, and Chris Poland was also on guitar. Their next album was So Far, So Good, So What, released in 1988. And at that point, they had gotten rid of both their drummer and their guitarist and replaced them with Chuck Baylor on drums and Jeff Young on guitar. And then their fourth album is Rust in Peace, released in 1990. I think this is the only album from 1990 we'll be touching on at all. And this is actually the lineup Megadeth had for 4 full albums, starting with this one. With, of course, Dave Mustaine and David Ellefson, with Nick Menza on drums and backing vocals, and Marty Friedman on guitar and backing vocals. And then Megadeth is, of course, still going. They actually had an album out this year. They have a lot of albums. I don't know when we'll ever get around to a Megadeth tournament. Time will tell. The next band of the Big Four we'll be talking about is Anthrax. And Anthrax was formed in 1981 in New York City, so they're an East Coast band, and they were formed by rhythm guitarist Scott Ian and bassist Dan Lilker. And the Anthrax albums we'll be covering in this tournament are, of course, their first 4 albums. So the first album we'll be covering from Anthrax is, of course, their first album, Fistful of Metal, released in 1984. Anthrax's lineup in Fistful of Metal was their original lineup. That was Scott Ian on rhythm guitar and backing vocals, Dan Lilker on bass, Neil Turbin on lead vocals, Dan Spitz on lead guitar and backing vocals, and Charlie Benant on drums. And then the band had a bit of a mix-up. The original bassist who helped form the band, Dan Lilker left the band, which is kind of nice for me because I don't have to say Lilker anymore. That's hard for me to say. And by the time their next album came around, the band had consisted of 5 members still, but they had completely lost their original bassist. Their lead vocalist was different on these albums as well. So they had on bass instead on bass they had Frank Bello, who was doing bass and backing vocals. Scott Ian still doing his thing, rhythm and backing vocals. Dan Spitz on lead guitar and backing vocals. Charlie Benant on drums, and then they had Joey Belladonna as their lead vocalist at that point on. Joey Belladonna would go on to be their lead vocalist until 1992, when they would end up with John Bush as their lead vocalist. I don't know what the circumstances are. Not really looking into that too much right now. So, their next album was 1985, and that was Spreading the Disease. Among the Living came out in 1987, and State of Euphoria in 1988. And those are all 3 albums with Joey Belladonna on their vocals. The next of the Big Four we'll be covering is Slayer. Slayer is easily the most evil of the groups, with a lot of satanic imagery. Their song names and everything are pretty gruesome. Definitely something your parents would have you institutionalized. You're listening to that Satan music. So Slayer actually is unlike some of these bands in that it had the same lineup for most of its career. So Slayer was formed in Huntington Park, California in 1981 by guitarists Kerry King and Jeff Hanneman, drummer David Lombardo, and bassist/vocalist Tom Araya. And they're actually the only band in this tournament who are no longer together. But they had the same members for most of their career, rather than constant lineup changes. Metallica is similar in that too. They had pretty much the same lineup with just like the bassist changing mostly. Later on, I think things might have changed up a little bit, but I didn't pay much attention to Metallica in the last, 10 years at least. 20 years maybe. So their first album is called Show No Mercy. And in that album, the band consisted of that original lineup: Tom Araya, Kerry King, Jeff Hanneman and Dave's album was Hell Awaits, released in 1985, and and they had the same lineup in that as well. After that, they released Rain in Blood in 1986. And this one I've heard, this album's really fucking good. Same lineup in that album as well. And the last album from Slayer we'll be covering is South of Heaven, released in 1988. South of Heaven is also a pretty rad album, same lineup there. So they're the only band in this tournament that has the same lineup throughout these 4 albums we'll be covering. I think they also have the most songs, because Slayer doesn't get overindulgent on their song lengths either. A lot of their songs are shorter, like say 3-4 minutes, compared to Metallica's, 9-minute epics that they'll throw in there. So it's going to be a pretty interesting tournament, I think. I hope y'all are into it, and I hope to see you real soon for the first episode coming up next week. Can't wait to see y'all for the Thrash Bash. Let's get going. Hope you have a great night, a fantastic afternoon, and a wonderful morning.